Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Doing fantastic today, Tim. Really couldn't be better. Hope everyone out there is feeling as good as they possibly can. And Tim, spill it. How are you?
I'm doing great today. Thanks a lot for asking. I'm excited to introduce this conversation with Kerrie Droban, who is an author and a lawyer, and she is really impressive. And she co-wrote a book called Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer tells her story. And that doctor is Dr. Lynne Fenton, and Kerrie Droban wrote this book with Dr. Fenton. And of course, this is about mass shooter James Holmes.
There were many moments during this interview that really surprised us. One of them being that Dr. Lynne Fenton treated James for 6 sessions and came to the conclusion that he was going to do something like this. And we covered a lot of gray area in terms of when a psychiatrist is supposed to alert others that their patient is having thoughts of violence. And because he didn't specifically say when and where he was going to kill people, she wasn't at that point yet where she was obligated to notify law enforcement or James's parents. He essentially said he kept having thoughts about people's lives having value and you needed to kill them in order to gain value for yourself. There are some remarkable moments in this conversation where a doctor of psychiatry coins somebody as being evil, which we explore in depth in this conversation.
And the book is great. You can get it on Amazon or wherever you get your books.
And be sure to visit Kerrie's website at kerriedroban.com. That's KerrieDroban. She's got a lot of cool books there, and we'll hopefully have her on again to discuss these works.
And if you want to hear Crawlspace ad-free, you can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, or you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm, and you can get the ad-free version of Crawlspace, but you can also get the ad-free versions of Missing and our bonus show that is bundled together with our other show, Missing.
Good call on the subscription service mentioned, Tim. But if someone wanted to follow us on social media, I'm a little unclear. Where should they go?
Great question, Lance. Well, they can follow us on all social media platforms at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
Before we get to Kerrie Droban, we're going to hear a quick word from our sponsors, so stick around.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome to the podcast, Kerrie Droban. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us because from the looks of it, you are very busy. You've written a number of books in the true crime genre, and we were fortunate enough to be contacted by one of your representatives to see if we could have you on the show to talk about your latest book. It's like right in the wheelhouse of what we talk about, and we honestly haven't talked about this topic specifically in too long, so you're the perfect guest to have on right now to bring this back to the surface of topics that we should be discussing right now. So thank you for your work on this and for joining us.
Thank you.
I would love to know about your writing. How did you get into it? How did you start writing about crime?
So Aurora is my 8th book. It's my 6th true crime book. I actually started out as a poet and then a novelist. And I was working as a defense attorney when I was approached by a group of undercover operatives who were part of Operation Black Biscuit to write their story. And that eventually became Running with the Devil. That sort of launched my true crime career. And I had an interesting niche in the beginning where I focused predominantly on writing about deep cover investigations, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and their symbiotic relationship with the mafia. So I became somewhat of an expert in that area and wrote about all the big 5 biker gangs, and then eventually moved from there into what I call the regular crime, the bombings and murders and things like that. So it's been a really interesting career, and Aurora has sort of been the culmination of all of that experience, particularly as a defense attorney and also bringing a lot of my expertise in criminal pathology to the table. So it was a really great opportunity.
What is the typical response when you tell somebody that you were part of something called Operation Black Biscuit?
For the most part, it's fascination, and then it's sort of fear. So there's like this repellent. I'm a conversation stopper in a lot of spaces. Actually, Running with the Devil was kind of a fascinating experience because I sort of wrote it undercover. I wasn't really allowed to speak about that experience for a couple of years because the operatives were still undercover and they really couldn't sell their story while they were employed by the ATF. And so I felt like I was kind of like a deep throat interviewing them in covert places, writing in secret. I didn't even have anything in writing with my editor, publisher, and agent at the time because I couldn't have a paper trail. So it was really a really surreal, sort of interesting experience in my foray into true crime. And Aurora was definitely not like that. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, tell us about your newest book, Aurora.
So Aurora came to me again, sort of by accident. I had actually pitched a different story to my agent, and Aurora, the psychiatrist whose story it's really about, wanted a writer for her story. So I was asked to write this book, and it was a 4-year odyssey because the publisher wanted to release it on the anniversary of this horrible mass shooting. And so it's the story of the psychiatrist, Dr. Fenton, who was the treating psychiatrist of mass murderer James Holmes, who of course went into the Colorado movie theater during the premiere of The Dark Knight Rises and just slaughtered 12 people and critically wounded 72 others. It's told through the lens of the psychiatrist, but it's a very interesting glimpse into the life cycle of a mass murderer. It's such a topical subject nowadays, unfortunately. And I know the vernacular is, how can we spot a killer? How can we stop this? Who can we blame for it? And how can we prevent it in the future? And so this book is an attempt to at least shed light on that subject. It doesn't provide a whole lot of answers because that's sort of the rub of it. It's very difficult to come up with one definitive answer or response to, why does this keep happening? Dr. Fenton, the psychiatrist, is the only psychiatrist in the history of psychiatrists to have ever been publicly outed. And so because she was outed as James Holmes treating psychiatrist, her life spiraled into an incredible journey where she received all kinds of death threats, and her whole life was turned upside down. She went into hiding, and so she really didn't have a voice during this entire ordeal. And so she really wanted to write this story, not only to tell what happened, but also to be a voice for those who really couldn't speak. They really didn't have a voice. So it was a way to tell their story in addition to hers. So that became a really interesting journey. James Holmes was sort of on the periphery of it, but the real issues that he raised were addressed, throughout the book.
And you mentioned Dr. Fenton. That's Dr. Lynne Fenton, who is the co-author of the book. When you first were approached to do this and to do it as a collaborative effort, how did that relationship come to be between you and Lynne?
The first thing I had to do was build rapport with her. She was telling me her story, but what is interesting about this story is that there was so much information that she didn't know at the time that she was treating James Holmes. So while she was telling me her 6 sessions with him, I had voluminous amounts of research to get into the head of James Holmes and to really understand his process and how he really orchestrated this mass shooting. So with Dr. Fenton, we at first talked over Zoom because COVID was happening. And so we had a number of conversations that we would talk over Zoom. And it's really hard to have that sort of visceral connection with a person unless you're seeing them in person. So I flew out to Colorado and I met her. I spent some time with her, but really it was a process over a period of years to actually get the story and find out what the story was. But in order to get into her head and really understand the kind of trauma that she went through, it was really a process of building that rapport and learning about her life. Because as you can imagine, it's really difficult to sit down with somebody and say, so tell me the 5 high points of your life. Most of us couldn't do that. I know I couldn't do that. And the challenge as a writer is to find the story within the story. She can tell me she's a psychiatrist. She can talk about all of her incredible, impressive education and her credentials, but that wasn't the story. I had to really get into her head and find out what was happening to her when she was treating Holmes. It was a challenge and also kind of fascinating for me at the same time.
How is she doing? Does she still practice?
She still practices. Her life, of course, changed immensely as a result of it. Probably hasn't fully recovered. I don't know that anybody can ever really recover from Holmes. And that was sort of the thing that I wasn't really prepared for when I went into the story, how much it was going to impact me on a personal level. So it's interesting. Everybody that Holmes affected has had sort of this ripple effect. And then it's a ripple effect of trauma, and how it becomes sort of the fabric of our lives. And, we've experienced James Holmes. And so even the responses that I've gotten from the people that have read the book have had that reaction. You can't really walk away from it without having it impact you in some way. And I think that was the point of writing the book.
You're saying as his doctor, she came out of that situation emotionally affected by him?
Yeah. So she had 6 sessions with him. She describes him as a very robotic, awkward, kind of strange human, really. Very uneasy, not able to really have complete sentence. I mean, his sentence structure was very staccato. He's a very strange human being. And her experience with it, she calls it sort of like she had an evil compression. In his presence, he sort of exuded this kind of evil and unease. What was interesting, even from a writer's perspective, is here's a psychiatrist whose profession, she's devoted her life to treating and helping people with mental illness, with mental health issues. But her description of Holmes is that he wasn't mentally ill. He was actually evil. And it was the first time she had been in the presence of somebody who was evil, and that she really didn't know how to help. It's important because from her perspective, she couldn't place a mental health hold on him because she didn't believe he was mentally ill. He didn't have a plan, or he didn't express a plan to her, a specific target, a specific victim. So she couldn't place any kind of hold on him. But she knew there was something seriously wrong with him or something off about him. And so it was that journey of having these 6 sessions where she just couldn't unlock who he was. Even more fascinating about that, and probably more compelling for readers, is, a psychiatrist is really at the mercy of what her patient reveals. And so the whole time that James Holmes is meeting with her, he's amassing an arsenal. He's explaining his theory of human capital to his ex-girlfriend. He assigned certain points and value to people, and he believed that by killing them, he could increase his own self-worth. And he had this theory, this fantasy or obsession, if you will, of killing people from the time he was a kid, from the time he was 10 years old, and he never told anybody. And so it's sort of this haunting portrait of a really evil person who had been plotting this for years, but never revealed or exposed anything to his psychiatrist. And so her hands were really tied in this. She knew something was wrong, couldn't do anything about it, but just it was an instinct.
Wow. So what was that instinct based? I mean, I suppose based off of her work, but like she couldn't put her finger on what it was exactly?
The interesting thing about her work is she can't really get a lot of collaborative secondary sources. If she's got a feeling about a person, if that person doesn't give the psychiatrist permission, she can't go and call up his family or, call up his friends or ask his professors, hey, do you notice anything wrong about this? I mean, what was sort of unique about Holmes is that he was referred to her in the first place, because most mass shooters are not under any kind of psychiatric care. They don't seek out counseling. They're not under mental health care. I mean, here's James Holmes. So I should just say this. He was a brilliant doctoral student in the neurosciences program at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. He was being schooled by some of the most brilliant minds in the country. So all these professors who saw him day in and day out, who knew he was awkward and strange, but there wasn't anything that they could really identify that made him dangerous. So they referred him to a social worker because he had problems standing up in front of the class and giving oral presentations. Okay, again, not this beacon of, oh my God, this person is evil or crazy. It's just this person is maybe a little anxious when he gives public presentations. So just by sheer luck, he winds up being referred to a social worker who sees him for 5 minutes and says, we need to keep this guy in the system, which is code for we need to watch this guy. We need to monitor him because there is something really wrong. And so that's how Dr. Fenton got him as her patient. And she was so concerned about her ability to treat him. Like he wasn't offering her any information, very monosyllabic responses to her questions. She knew almost nothing about him. And so her concern very early on was maybe he didn't like women. Maybe he didn't relate to her because she was a woman. So she actually consulted with her supervisor, brought him in and said, maybe you can help draw him out or something. So she did everything she could at the time with the resources that she had to really try to find out what was going on with him. But even her supervisor couldn't do it. And she even at the end of it, her very last session with Holmes, she wound up violating HIPAA, contacting his mother and asking his professors and saying, has he always been like this? Or is there something that has happened that has caused some kind of psychotic break? Tell me what's going on. She really feared that she had another Virginia Tech on her hands, but there wasn't anything she could do about it. And I should add that Dr. Fenton was an expert on mass shooting. She actually taught about mass shootings. Being in Colorado, one of her lecturers actually dealt with Columbine and she invoked the Virginia Tech massacre. So she was very well versed in what to look for, who these guys were. She was exactly the right person to have Holmes show up.
All of her sessions, I imagine, were documented. She needed to, I guess, red flag certain behaviors, right?
Right. She kept copious notes and, in fact, testified to those notes. And nothing in her notes indicated that he had any type of mental illness or any type of, she was really trying to get at the core reason for why he had such strange thoughts. He told her he had fantasies of killing people, but there wasn't anything definitive, and that's part of the problem with the resources or the tools that psychiatrists have. If the patient doesn't identify a specific target or a specific plan, they can't really do anything. They can't put them on a mental health hold. They can't do things that they would ordinarily be able to do. And the other thing I should add is that Holmes had a notebook where he chronicled his plan, his detail, but he didn't share that notebook with Dr. Fenton until the night of the massacre when he mailed it to her.
And you said that she actually violated HIPAA by informing his family about his intentions and how the sessions were going because she wanted to know, was there anything that had happened? But I guess it's a really fine line then. So you're saying that if he didn't have a specific target, then it really wasn't him saying that he planned on harming somebody else? Because isn't that one of the caveats is that if you have any motivation to harm somebody else or yourself, then they can go to law enforcement or family members?
Right. And he never expressed that. So he flunked his oral boards and announced to her that he was done. He was dropping out of school and he was not going to continue with his sessions. And she was so alarmed by this that she thought, I'll give you psychiatric help for free. She was willing to take him on for free because she was so concerned that he was going to do harm, but he didn't have a specific target in mind. He didn't tell her, I'm going to kill so-and-so. She violated HIPAA to get more information from his mom. She wanted to know, is there some kind of psychotic break? Is there something that I need to know about that could send him over the edge to where he's going to do this? So it wasn't that she was able to disclose her sessions. It was she was trying to get information from the mom, and she tried to, get information from his professor. She was doing whatever she could to come up with a reason to send him for a mental health hold.
And what does mom say?
Well, his mom had a very interesting response to Dr. Fenton's call, and she said, I've been waiting my whole life for this call, which just goes to show you that the mom had some issues with James Holmes. And there were issues. And that came out during the trial because, his defense was insanity. They really did try to go back into his history. And because it was a death penalty case, a lot of his family members testified, and come to find out that he was always peculiar and he did have, some issues, and his mom had some issues controlling him. And so these were all things that would have been helpful had Dr. Fenton known about it, but she didn't have access to it. There was no way to really know any of this. And that's the unfortunate thing when you have, psychiatrists involved. Again, they're only at the mercy of what their patients will reveal.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Through your work on this and your relationship with Dr. Fenton, has there been any sort of consistency with these types of characteristics in other mass shooters?
The consistency across the board with mass shooters is that they're all between the ages of 18 and 24. And that's about as much commonality as you can have between them, because it's really impossible to spot a mass shooter. And that's the problem. You can offer certain insights and you can analyze what happened with James Holmes and maybe glean from that there might be commonalities. But the sad fact of the matter is that they're all different. Most have not had any mental health intervention or care, and many are not mentally ill, which sounds like an oxymoron, because how could somebody who commits these atrocities not be mentally unstable? But in fact, many are not, and many have not sought mental health treatment. And so it's frustrating and alarming that there isn't a common denominator. I will say that in the research I did, what I found that was somewhat helpful is that probably in 99% of these cases, the shooters have left some kind of manifesto, something in writing. They had something that they either revealed beforehand or came out during the act itself. So to some extent, these mass shooters want some kind of credit. They want people to know, why they've done it. Either they've been marginalized in the world, they've been bullied, they've been oppressed, something to where they want people to know. I mean, that was the case in the Virginia Tech shooting, where he had very violent plays and poems that he submitted to his creative writing instructor. It was the case in quite a few, actually, where they either had videos that they uploaded onto social media. So I guess the warning or the red flag for people to watch out for is if they have something that is actually broadcasting or letting someone know, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, that's a time to jump in, and say, maybe we ought to take a second look at this person. But I think a lot of the fear that surrounds these cases and these individuals is the person who is identifying this is getting it wrong. There's that fear of, if I call this person out because he's acting strangely or his writings are disturbing, and I think he might do something and he doesn't do anything, well, now you're singling the person out and maybe labeling them and maybe scarring them, so that's the fear, I think, for people in identifying these kinds of cases before they happen.
I find it kind of scary, to be honest, that Dr. Lynne Fenton called him evil. We often talk on this show about how these killers aren't evil. Don't call them a monster, because that's making them sound like they're supernatural, when the fact is they are human. This is something that humans are capable of doing. When you say he's not mentally ill, so he wanted to do this, it's like breaking my brain to even think about, to be honest.
It is disturbing. I mean, I am a defense attorney and I did do capital work. And so for a majority of my career, my job was quite literally to save killers, to go back into their historical data and find the trauma or the vulnerabilities or the things that may have impacted them and may have made them a killer, right? And that's the mitigation, if you will. How do you dispel this notion that people are not natural born killers? And so I think the fascination for me with this book was also taking that perspective, because I understood the insanity defense, but I also understood what I was reading in the evidence that I was looking at. So Holmes was interviewed for 24 hours by his court-appointed psychiatrist. And that's where a lot of the insight into his thinking and his planning and plotting came from. There is, I should say, that there is a difference, obviously, in law between the legal definition of insanity versus, whether somebody is mentally ill or has mental health problems. So was he legally insane? No, because he methodically plotted this. It was calculated. There were specific targets planned and specific victims. For example, he writes in his notebook, and he's asked this and tells his court-appointed psychiatrist, who is not Dr. Fenton, that he cased different venues. He wanted mass casualties. He thought about and ruled out an airport. He thought about and ruled out something like a Tylenol scandal, he researched and studied other mass shooters, which is very common, actually. That's another thing that a lot of these guys do, is they study each other. They either idolize each other or they study each other's methods and they try to improve upon it. And one of the things that Holmes says he wanted to do was to study his own brain and to have his brain studied by other people, which is why he purposefully wanted to remain alive. And at the time, he was, I think, the only mass shooter who actually survived his shooting. Now, of course, unfortunately, we have so many more mass shootings and people surviving it. But at the time, he was the only one that survived, and he wanted to survive because he wanted people to study his brain. And the other thing that is kind of compelling about his case is that he didn't just plan to enter Theater 9 during the premiere of The Dark Knight. He also booby-trapped his own apartment. So he created 2 crime scenes, and he booby-trapped his apartment to blow up when first responders came there so that nobody would stop the massacre that was happening in the movie theater. And that is really diabolical, and it's really well planned and thought out. He's interviewed and talks to bomb techs and people that are, it took bomb experts 4 days to dismantle the bombs in his apartment. So, I mean, these are the things that are hard to overlook, and they're hard to chalk up to mental illness. And that's what's really sort of stunning about this case, is that you can read the book and literally look at, this is the life cycle of a mass murderer. This is what he went through. This is his thought process, very determined, methodical, for years thinking about this.
I have to say, him wanting or claiming he wants his brain to be studied after killing 12 people is really disingenuous to me, because he could have just done it before. He could have just been open and said, look, this is what I want to do. That's just frustrating to me.
The thing that I think, apart from, and I had to be really careful with this book, because I definitely didn't want to sensationalize the crime or focus so much on James Holmes that the book then becomes about the killer, which is very tricky in true crime, because the killer's mindset and why somebody does what they do and their pathology is so fascinating. But I wanted it to be a balance, because I wanted it to be through the lens of Dr. Fenton, and also pay homage to the story, the larger story in this book, which is the courage and bravery of these first responders. So you take the worst of humanity and you juxtapose it against the best of humanity. And that is a powerful story, because that talks about this ripple effect. So out of this tragedy, you have these police officers who behaved in extraordinary ways, and their story would never have been told but for a vehicle like this book. But I think their stories are extraordinary because they went above and beyond what, any job description would have, had them do. But they went and pulled out critically wounded survivors, and they drove them in their own police cars to hospitals, neighboring hospitals. The way that the movie theater was structured, and Holmes knew this, there was no way for ambulances and larger vehicles to even access that movie theater. They were stopped by curbs and parking lots full of other moviegoers and different theaters. I mean, it was just mass pandemonium. And so these first responders who had the foresight to do this was really extraordinary. So that was one story I wanted to tell. And I also wanted to tell the story of the lawyers and what they went through to defend somebody like this, because many of them, this was a career-ending case. They didn't recover emotionally on a lot of levels. There were all kinds of stories within stories like that. And even the juries. I mean, as a lawyer, I'm not allowed to go and interview jurors following a death penalty case, because we don't want to have a chilling effect on the next jury that comes in. But in this book, I was able to have insight into what the jurors experienced for months, listening to this kind of violence and horror over and over again, and get a completely different perspective from what it's like to be the one who decides, And in this case, there was one juror who voted for life. And that's why Holmes did not get the death penalty. So can you imagine being that one person?
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Back to Dr. Fenton. Can you imagine being the person who saw all of the red flags, like heard those alarms, and wanted so badly to say, this is a ticking time bomb right here, and then reading or hearing about it? I mean, that must have been absolutely crushing.
It was absolutely horrific for her, because she all of a sudden was placed in a situation where her own life was in jeopardy. So she was actually a victim of Holmes as well. She was outed by Holmes' defense attorney, which, whether that was deliberate or accidental, it completely altered the landscape. Dr. Fenton had to immediately go into hiding. She had to order a bulletproof vest. She had to cancel all of her patients who needed her. I mean, she had a caseload of maybe 80 patients at the time that she had to transfer to different psychiatrists, and leave the state. It had massive impact on her practice, on her life, on everything. I think to this day, it's all a little surreal for her. I mean, how do you actually recover? And then not only did that happen, but then she had this specter of lawsuits coming her way, civil lawsuits from the family members, from, the movie theater, from her own university. It's horrific. So she goes through all of the civil lawsuits and then has to prepare for the criminal trial. So she can't ever really start healing from this, because she has to keep it front row center for 3 years or more until she testifies. And when she testifies, there are snipers on the rooftop of the courthouse. They're afraid she's going to get picked off while she's going in to testify. I mean, I can't imagine that kind of trauma, based on somebody you're trying to help them. I mean, this is your work, your livelihood. I mean, I've been a defense attorney for a very long time, and I've never been in a situation where I feel like, my own life is going to be in danger as a result of a client or something that I've done. So it was interesting for me to try to put myself in her situation, as another professional. What would this look like? I mean, she and I had, in many respects, had similar professions. We're both in a listening profession, and we both have confidentiality between client or patient. And so there are certain things that we really can't disclose. So it was an interesting sort of life imitating art experience for me as the writer. But that's how I was able to at least feel something for what she was going through.
And she received death threats as well, huh?
Yes, very credible death threats. And some of them are actually listed verbatim in the book. They came from emails, hang-up phone calls. She had an entire security patrol around her house. She had to move. She had to leave her house. The day that she was outed, she had to crouch down in the floorboard of a car. She couldn't even get her own belongings, and she had pets at the time. So a colleague of hers had to grab clothing and make sure that her pets were taken care of, and whisk her off to an undisclosed location. I mean, that's how bad it was. And so when she was finally, out of it, when the trial had ended, she still, had moments where she had to alter her route to work, worried that someone was tailing her or following her. It never stops, that specter of, is somebody going to take me out because they don't agree with what I did?
Do you think that she has any interest in interviewing James Holmes again or working with him again to get more insight?
No. No, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think she has any interest of knowing anything that happens to him. I mean, he received the longest sentence in U.S. history for his crimes. He received over 3,000 years in prison. For a while, he was moved every so often, sort of in secret, because his life was in danger in prison. Yeah, I think she would be thrilled to have this behind her, but I think it was very cathartic for her to be able to to get the story out finally. Like, this is what actually happened.
Because he had said that he wanted his, I guess, brain studied after the fact, was she ever contacted by other doctors or other psychologists to provide like a reference or any sort of advice? Like maybe her story is inspiring another doctor to look into him, to maybe apply certain attributes to other potential mass shooters?
To my knowledge, there has been no one that has reached out to her. Maybe in the beginning, she had maybe a handful of colleagues that said, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. But no other psychiatrist has really reached out to her to say, what a horrible thing has happened to you. Can we talk about it? You got to wonder, like, there have to be other psychiatrists that have clients either similar to Holmes or that they've had questions about. And you would think there would be some kind of a support network, but there really isn't. And so that either begs the question, is there a chilling effect where psychiatrists cannot cross that line of, patient confidentiality, and perhaps that's the case? Or is it something more insidious than that, where there really aren't, these mass shooters are not seeking professional help. So they are not in front of a psychiatrist like Dr. Fenton.
What do you think? Why did he do what he did?
Well, I think he really believed that people had certain value. And I should say he was very adamant with Dr. Fenton that he was not depressed. He was not homicidal. He was not suicidal. It wasn't any of those things. In fact, he told his court-appointed psychiatrist that he viewed killing with the same emphasis or effect as he would a piece of broccoli. So that's his mindset. And I think that for him, these thoughts of killing were very much like obsessive compulsive, perhaps. They were thoughts he couldn't get out of his head. Maybe he needed to relieve those thoughts. And maybe the only way to do that was to kill, because he really truly believed that he was going to increase his own self-worth by doing that. It's sort of like a serial killer has described killing people like an addiction, like somebody needs coffee, they need to kill. And so when they kill, there's some relief that comes with that. If I was going to theorize about that, I would think that that's what Holmes was doing. He wanted to get some kind of relief from these obsessive thoughts, and he fully believed that he would increase his own self-worth by doing it.
Well, if that was his purpose, to achieve a higher self-worth, and everybody else were, the values in order for him to do so, did empathy play in at all? Like, I kind of feel bad that these people I'm seeing as values to my self-worth. And was he also considering himself as one of those values so somebody else could kill him to increase their self-worth?
There was no indication in anything that I reviewed that had anything whatsoever to do with empathy. He didn't seem to have empathy for anyone. And a lot of that is, I talk about this somewhat in the book, but this idea of video games, if he was assigning points to people, to me, it was very much like a video game. You knock off a few people, you increase your point value, almost as if he was an avatar out there knocking off people. And so there wasn't any obvious feeling there. And that's an interesting question, because I had that same thought of if it's increasing his self-worth, then what does he think of himself? There wasn't any indication in what I reviewed that he had low self-esteem. Quite the opposite, actually. He thought he had a fantastic brain that everybody should study. So it really didn't make a lot of sense, but it was something he adamantly believed.
It's an incredible story. Congrats on writing the book, and I mean it's a story that needed to be told. I think you and Dr. Lynne Fenton coming together to write this book, I think is really cool. That's the cool part of it. Do you still you practice criminal defense currently?
I do still practice, not to the same level that I did, and I don't do capital work anymore. I had actually stopped doing capital work before I started writing Aurora. That kind of work really takes a toll. And I think at the time that I decided to stop it, I had done maybe 15 capital cases. I mean, those are people that you just don't get out of your head. They live with you for a long time. And so to have ever had to represent someone like Holmes, I can't imagine what his attorneys deal with on a daily basis, because you don't forget those cases.
With the work that you've done writing these true crime nonfiction books. How does Aurora stand up as far as how did it affect you compared to the other ones?
Aurora really, I think, is in a category of its own. It was, I think maybe because I am a defense attorney and I've done capital work and I was able to really understand what his lawyers went through. I think it was very difficult for me to write, and just going through all of the information that I read about Holmes and feeling like I had to get into his head, it stayed with me a very long time. And I think it's one of those books, again, it's sort of like one of my capital cases that you don't really recover from. It just, you think about it a lot. It informs a lot of, probably my next books that I work on. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been able to write it, because I think it's an important book. And I think, fortunately or unfortunately, it's going to have a place, for a long time.
What's your next book about?
Well, my next book is, it's going to be a case that involves a stalker. So it's going into something lighter. start researching and investigating a pretty famous stalking case, and I'm just at the very beginning stages of it.
Love to have you back on to talk about that when it's ready. Also would love to have you come on to talk about your time with the biker gangs that you pulled Hunter S. Thompson on. Those stories must have been crazy.
Yes, they were. They were crazy. In fact, I've spoken quite a bit about that. I call it doing time for the crime, because it's there's so many stories within the stories of how to get those stories, because there's not, there's all interview. There's not a lot of corroborating, research out there. So it was definitely a fascinating time in my life.
Yeah, we'll have your people contact our people again.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. And where is the best place for our listeners to pick up your book?
They can get it on Amazon or my website, kerriedroban.com. It's DROBAN. Are all there with some other tidbits about the backstories of some of these books.
My last question, it probably has no answer, but it was a tragedy. What James Holmes did, a horrific tragedy, amazing work on the book with Dr. Fenton. Did anything good come of this? Can you possibly say that anything good comes of a horrific tragedy like this?
Yeah, I think the good of it is that it continues the conversation. And I think that we can't forget about the victims, or the survivors, the ordeal that they went through. But I think the conversation needs to continue, and that's the conversation about gun control and mental health, and how do you spot these guys, and what can we do, and how can we prevent this? I mean, there aren't easy answers to it, but I think that people need to keep talking about it. And so I think that's really the hope that, that I have for this book, is that it at least begins that conversation and continues it.